Okay, so hemp is grown and harvested using traditionally available equipment, asterisk, right? So we're going to plant hemp with a grain drill. You can plant it no-till or conventional till, it doesn't matter. There are plenty of people who will broadcast and then roll the seed instead of drilling, and that is okay if weather is perfect. Right? So if the weather is perfect and you broadcast the seed and then roll it, it'll germinate and emerge out of the soil in 2 to 3 days, and all will be right and well with the world. Last year, I had a farmer who did it that way for me, and in the beginning of June, we went into a drought, and it didn't rain for the entire month of June, and the seed just sat and waited and waited and waited. And well, if you've just rolled it, it's not really hidden. And so the birds came and ate a whole lot of it. And so we lost a ton in that field because of it. So the research that I do with my partner farms is on nitrogen rate trials for grain production. And so they're each doing somewhere between 10 and 15 acres for me. So it's not a tremendous amount of land, but it's enough to be a bummer. And so if weather is perfect and you know you're going to be able to germinate and emerge within a couple of days, great, that's absolutely fine, it'll work. If not, drilling it's the way to go. So current grain production suggestions say to treat it a bit like winter wheat. And what's interesting is that in Canada they've said that that the more nitrogen you apply, and they've applied up to 200 pounds of nitrogen, the greater the grain yield. My observations last year were you get above 150 pounds of nitrogen and you start to get lodging, just like you would get in wheat, where it's just too top heavy. And so I was walking through these fields and there were these huge grain heads and the plant was just half over. And maybe that would still be okay, but harvest becomes even more challenging. And so we're trying to dial in really where are those sweet spots of where we're going to get enough of a grain yield and not be losing out too much because we're not putting on enough nitrogen. The fiber crop is less nutrient demanding because you're not producing the grain, right? The hemp grain has a tremendous amount of protein in it. The central molecule or the building blocks of proteins are amino acids, and the central portion of amino acid is a nitrogen compound, and so you need a lot of nitrogen to produce high protein things. If you're not producing the grain, you don't need as much nitrogen, and so we've had a lot of success with just using manure applications for our nitrogen applications for our fiber varieties without any additional bit. There is some question about where the CBD varieties fall there, because you want to enhance metabolism for the CBD varieties. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence about some micronutrient interactions for the CBD varieties. There is no research to support any of it. And so this year, we are working with a company in California that produces a metabolism enhancer for plants, and it has been shown in the marijuana industry to increase the amount of THC produced because it's increasing metabolism. And we're going to see if it's also going to work for CBD without making the crop go hot. So we're not using the high CBD varieties to do that because they're already flirting with that 0.3%. We're going to use some of the European varieties, that stuff that's coming over from Prague for me, that's supposed to top out around 3% CBD, and we want to see if we can bump that up to 5 or 6, right, using this metabolite. So we're trying to dial in the agronomy right now. We're finding a lot of anecdotes, and my favorite thing to remind people is that anecdotes are not evidence, right? Because one person says, I did this and this is what I got, therefore X equals Y, right? It doesn't work that way. And so we're trying to do some replicates of strip trials, and our data has been compromised the past couple of years because of the weather. So we're hoping that this year we could do small plot trials and in small plots come up with data. The problem with small plots is that it's really difficult to expand from a plot the size of this room to what's going to happen in a 10-acre field. And so we're working, but this is the starting point that we start with. Crop rotation is important. So we have a lot of people entering the CBD market that are not farmers. We have a lot of people that call me constantly saying, hi, my great aunt Sally has 10 acres of land upstate and I live in the city and I want to grow CBD. And I say, go learn something, then come talk to me. Because like any other crop, there are pests that will say, oh, hey, you're growing this year after year after year. We're going to come live here, and you're going to see that you're going to have yield that's good for 1 year and maybe for 2 years, and then for 3 and 4 and 5, your yields are going to drop because your pest pressure is going to increase. And so it's really important to plan crop rotation. And so we have people coming from the outside of agriculture world saying, we're going to become farmers and grow hemp. And they have no idea that that means that you're going to grow more than just hemp. Right? In general, we're seeing a lot of benefit of hemp following alfalfa. That's a really nice rotation. Hemp can also follow cereal grains, but we don't grow a ton of oats. We don't grow a ton of wheat in New York State, and so it's a bit difficult for us to do that. Hemp shares insect pests with corn, particularly the CBD hemp that we are growing, because the European corn borer loves the thick hemp stalks. So if you're growing for fiber or grain, it's not as big a deal because your stalks are going to be about the size of my pinky or the size of my pointer finger. If you're growing for CBD in the Christmas tree style, you're producing stalks that are about yay big. And the European corn borer loves them. And so that's a really difficult crop to rotate with, so to have corn in there. Hemp shares fungal pests with both soy and wheat. And so if we were dreaming of having some sort of corn, soy, hemp rotation, it's not going to happen. Right? And so what seems to be working best, and what seems to be what they're also suggesting in Canada, is to have hemp follow alfalfa. Okay. And there are no pesticides currently labeled for use with hemp. That means that the real difference between organic and non-organic hemp is, did you fertilize with manure or other animal product source fertilizer, or are you using an inorganic fertilizer? Because you can't apply anything to either of them. That's going to change quickly with the passage of the new Farm Bill. Previously, companies were not willing to do the research to include hemp on their label because it wasn't legal. So they don't want it to be said on their label because it's not a legal product. They don't want to look like they are encouraging an illegal product, right? Now it's legal. And so the research has begun. It'll probably take 2-ish years for that to be rolling. So I would say by next year's growing season, maybe the season after, we should start seeing products that are labeled for cannabis. So what are the biggest pests that we see? Weed pressure is huge. When we first started growing hemp, there were a lot of people that were asking questions about whether hemp was going to become the next agricultural pest. Hemp is a baby. It is the worst. It does not grow in wet soil. It won't germinate. It will kill the seed. If a weed germinates and emerges at the same time as the hemp, almost all of our common field crop weeds will outcompete the hemp. All right, so here is a field full of mustard, and here what's a little bit difficult for you to see right there is a Japanese beetle. In Kentucky, they've had a lot of problems with Japanese beetle. Here in New York, they hang out on the male plants and don't do much damage. Now, each year I've seen a little bit more, but I mean, you'll get a little bit of a bite here and a little bit of a bite there, but they're not defoliating. You're really not seeing the pressure. And in fact, what I was seeing is that in the field where this picture was taken in particular, there was a lot of pigweed in there, and pigweed wins the battle with hemp every time. And there were a couple of Japanese beetles that were on the male flowers, and then you look down, and there was just tons of Japanese beetle damage on the pigweed. And so it's almost like a trap crop. right? So not that I would suggest that anybody encourage pigweed in your hemp field, but it does sort of pull the insects off of the hemp. So that on the right there is pigweed. Here on the left is one of the rushes. But so in general, it is really important to know ragweed will outcompete, goldenrod will outcompete, pigweed, lamb's quarter, all of our common field crop weeds will grow as tall, if not taller than the hemp if they germinate at the same time. And so you're obviously losing yield to it. So using methods that are going to decrease our weed pressure is really important. So what are the things that we have the ability to do? We can grow a cover crop, right? We can grow a cover crop over the winter before, and then kill the cover crop with Roundup, leave the stubble there, so you're leaving the cover there, so you're stopping your you're stopping your weed seeds from getting the light to be able to emerge. And then if you no-till your hemp, all is well in the world, except it's been really wet, right? So in these years where things have been really wet, that transition to no-till, this is not the crop to do it with, right? If you have a field that's been no-till for a really long time, this will work out beautifully. We tend to do a lot of minimal tillage at Morrisville, and so we're not truly no-till, so we still use an airway, and we've had a lot of success with hemp that way. But managing your weed pressure, and so managing the timing of application and the timing of field preparation is absolutely key. So a lot of the fungal pests are attacking our stalks as well as the plants. We have fusarium, we have pythium. They are common fungal pests for things like soybeans, the white mold. And so these are the problems that we're seeing out in the field. We're not seeing enough to really impact yield loss yet, but again, this is year 4. And so with only 3 growing seasons behind us, we expect pest pressure to increase as well. Right, with that 2018 Farm Bill, we sort of talked about this a little bit. We can now automatically go across state lines, except that's being challenged and folks aren't, right? So if this state doesn't have a hemp program yet and that state does, in the past, it's been a gray area of whether or not you can drive through it. With the 2018 Farm Bill, it said, no, it's totally legal, interstate commerce is fine. And yet folks are still running into trouble that way. So there's still a bit of gray areas, but there shouldn't be, right? Everything should be legal now. Okay, so what are some of the things that we need to know about? We haven't been growing hemp for a very long time, which means that we haven't been breeding hemp for a very long time. One of the things that stands out most to me is that when you drive by a cornfield, right, you have an even crop across the field. When you drive by a soybean field, you have an even crop across the field. When you drive by a hemp field, it looks like rolling hills, because we have not been doing the 70 years of breeding that corn and soybean have got. And so there's still enough variability within the genetic code to make it so that you are seeing variability in the field. There's also, we haven't bred for the best traits that are necessary. So in the illicit world, right, the cannabis sativa has been bred for the past 100 years to increase THC content, and man, have we been good at doing that, right? But when it comes to agricultural production, we haven't bred for winter hardiness, although it is pretty hardy. We haven't bred for moisture hardiness, and so the hemp will show you where every weak spot in your field is, particularly where every wet spot in your field is, like no other crop. If there's one small area that is just slightly wetter than all the areas around it, you'll see that the hemp there is 2 feet shorter, right? And so we don't have the genetics to produce the strong crop that we see in our other field crops. And so there's a lot of stand variability. And so that leads to difficulties in harvesting, right? You don't see a combine going through a soybean field raising and lowering the cutter head, right? You set it and you go. With hemp, you're constantly trying to decide, do I need to raise up? Do I need to put down? Where am I in cutting here? And so it is a real tricky spot that we're in right now. It will get better, but right now that's where we are. And so that leads to yield variability. You can see here, this is a really small seed and this is a really large seed. So seed size becomes important if you're farming for grain, because once you've combined the seed, you need to clean it. And grain is cleaned based on mesh size, screen mesh size, right? And so if you have a wide range of seed size, then you don't have a consistent mesh size for cleaning it, and you end up with either losing some or with grain that isn't quite clean enough. And so it really is tricky. In fact, so one of the varieties that I'm growing this year, it is supposed to have a larger seed size and a more consistent seed size. It's why I chose this variety, was for what their claims are about the grain, so that we should be able to harvest a bit more easily. These are also 4 plants from the same field, and that had all received the same amount of fertility. This is from 2 years ago, and you'll see the difference in the seed head length. And so the amount of grain being produced, it can be variable. And so we're working on that variability, because it was all the same variety. Could have been because of spot differences in nutrient content within the field. These weren't from specific nitrogen rate trials. These were just from one big field that had received manure applications. And so there could have been fertility variability that needed to be dialed in, but still all the same variety, and you're going from the difference of a 3-foot grain head to a 1-foot grain head. And that's going to impact not only the amount of grain that you're harvesting, obviously, but where you're going to cut. Because when you're harvesting your hemp, you want to take into, particularly for grain, you want to take into the combine the least amount of fiber that you possibly can, because the fiber is what screws us all up. Okay, so we'll talk about harvesting in a second, right? And here's a difference in the thickness of your stalk size, so that there were some stalks in that field that were the size of my pinky and some that were the size of my thumb. Does that variability matter if you're harvesting for grain? No. If you're harvesting for fiber, absolutely, because the differences in your stalk thicknesses change the amount of the fiber that's there. So the hemp stalk has 2 types of fiber, and it has bast fiber. That's what we make textiles out of. And it has hurd fiber. That's the absorbent woody material that's kind of like balsa wood. If you are growing for fiber and you want to sell to somebody who is going to produce hempcrete, then you're selling them your hurd. And so you want as much hurd as possible, so you want thicker stalks. If you are growing for somebody who is going to reinforced plastics, then they want the bast fiber. And so that bast fiber is on the outside, and so you want the thinnest stalks that you can get, because surface area is what you're looking for. So what you are growing for determines how you plant. If you are looking for very thin stalks, so you're going for the bast fibers, then what you want to do is plant at a higher rate. You plant somewhere around 45 pounds of seed to the acre, because you want those plants to be competing with each other. So they're spending all of their energy growing up. If you want to grow for the hurd, and you're growing for fiber, then you're more concerned with a thicker stalk, and so you don't want them competing as much. You want that stalk to be able to bulk up more, and so you'll plant at closer to your grain rate, which is about 25 pounds of pure live seed per acre. Some of the recommendations coming out of Canada are for even lower, for somewhere between 18 and 20 pounds of pure live seed per acre. That depends on the variety. So hemp doesn't like poorly drained soil. I think the next picture is a perfect example of this. So that picture on your right, that's all one field. It was all planted at the same time, and you see a really distinct line through the field where what's closest to us is just soil, and what's behind that, you see green plants growing, and the only difference is wet, dry, right? Hemp does not like wet. Hemp is a plant that is triggered to go into its flowering stage, to go from the vegetative stage to the reproductive stage, based on the hours of darkness. Except stress can also trigger that. And so this is 2 years ago on the right here, we saw plants that were about 6 inches tall flowering, right? And at first we thought, is it because it's been so rainy and gray and it's because they're thinking it's hours of darkness? But really it looks like that water stress, they were like, let's just reproduce because we're not going to live through this one. Right? So these are the things that are tricky for us, that we want to make sure that they don't go into the reproductive stage before we're ready for them to. Right? And then here also it is on the left is a field that is being checked for the emergence of weeds. So we check all of our fields every other week, and we measure the average height of the hemp as compared to the average height of the weed species that are around it. And we look at the variety of weed species that are there. And if you see anything that is remotely as tall as your hemp when it is first coming out, then you've lost the battle already. If the hemp gets to be about knee high, then the growth rate is so fast that it can shade out what's around it, and it does a great job of preventing its own weeds. And that's why planting time is so important. Okay. Right. So I think I've said that a bunch of times. Right. So here are some examples of some of the pests. So this is what the fusarium can do to your crop. It looks really pretty. It's sort of neat. You look and the leaves turn these like tie-dye green and yellow, like bright yellow, but you don't actually want to see that. So and what it also does is that comparison on the right is a healthy small root system to a fusarium infected root system. And so that's really where the trouble is coming. So this is one field. My students have to work in the hemp fields all the time, and they get a little bit grumpy about it. And we can see this field has some really wet spots and some really dry spots and some not so well fertilized spots. And you know, for these students here, it's barely coming up to their waist, whereas those students on the right, it's about shoulder height, and that's this thing. Like I was pointing my camera this way, and then I turned and pointed it this way. So this is at the same moment in the same field. Okay, it's a little unfair that the kid on the far right there makes it look like it's a lot shorter than it actually is. He's 6'9".